I will start right now. I'll read from the first, a short excerpt from the first chapter. And I have another section that's a little bit later in the novel that I could read. And then I have a short section that's from the sequel that I'm working on for the novel. So I think that should fit in. I don't think the sections are too long. I'll preface it by saying when I started doing the Gilda Stories, I started writing it, a lot of people, particularly people in the African American community, would say, life has been so horrible. Why would you want to write about anything horrible? And the assumption being that, there was no space really for people of color in the genre, which was, in fact, seems true if you looked at the bookshelves. So once I convinced people that I was actually creating a Black lesbian feminist vampire, then they really didn't want to see me. But despite that, it has remained in print for 30 years. So let me get started just by reading a little bit from the first chapter, right at the beginning. The girl slept restlessly, feeling the prickly straw as if it were teasing pinches from her mother. The stiff, moldy odor transformed itself into her mother's starchy dough smell. The rustling of the girl's body in the barn was something like the sound of fatback frying in the cooking shed behind the plantation's main house. At other moments in her dream, the crackling of the hay was like the crackling of the brush as her mother raked the bristles through the girl's thicket of dark hair before beginning the intricate pattern of braided rows. She'd travel by night for hours before daring to stop. Her body held out until a deserted farmhouse where it surrendered to a demanding sleep hemmed by fear. Then the sound of walking, a man moving stealthily through the dawn light toward her. In the dream, it remained what it was, danger. Handle of a knife she'd stolen when she ran away the day before. The rough shirt that hung loosely from her young frame, invisible to the red-faced man who stood laughing over her, pulling her by one leg from beneath the pile of hay. The girl did not scream, but buried herself in the beating of her heart alongside the hidden knife and tried to remember some of the stories that her mother, now dead, had pieced together from many different languages to describe the journey to this land. The legends sketched a picture of a Fulani past, a natural rhythm of life without bondage. It was a memory that receded more with each passing year. She looked up at the beast from this land as his face lost the laugh and became creased with lust. His center was bright and blinding as he placed his arms, one on each side of the girl's head, lowered himself. He started to enter her, but before his hand finished pulling her open, while it still tingled with the softness of her insides, she entered him with her heart, which was now a wood-handled knife. He made a small sound as his last breath hurried to leave him, the blood washing slowly down her breastbone and soaking to the floor below. It was like a bath, a cleansing, she thought. The girl moved quietly from beneath him, looking down at the blood soaking her shirt and trousers. She felt no disgust. It was the blood signaling the death of a beast and her continued life. She trembled, unable to tell if this was really happening to her all over again, or if she was dreaming it again. She held one dirty hand up to her broad brown face and cried heartily. That was how Gilda found her, huddled in the root cellar of a small farmhouse on the road outside of New Orleans in 1850. I'm not going to hurt you, Gilda said, and with that, pulled the girl to her feet. Gilda had seen a runaway slave before and recognized the look and smell of terror. I could use you, gal, come on, was all Gilda said as she lifted the girl easily and carried her out to her buggy. So that's how the Gilda Stories begins, with this escaped slave who is taken in by Gilda and her partner, who is a Lakota Sioux, who raise her and ultimately invite her into their world. They raise her in a bordello, but it's a really great bordello in which women learn to shoot and sew, and they can be prostitutes or not be prostitutes. It's kind of like a finishing school, but for the working class. And in New Orleans in the 1800s. And Gilda invites the girl to take on their life, which she does choose to do. And before we talk, if that's okay, Maisha, I'd like to read the second section from the novel because it gives you a better sense of how these vampires are different from the traditional. And I studied enough to figure out how everybody else did it so I could try to do it differently. And let me just find the right page. So ultimately what happens is the girl takes on the name Gilda. And so the book is essentially about the girl who grows up to be Gilda. This section in the novel is in Rosebud, Missouri, 1921. So that's, I don't know, I can't count, but that's a little while later. She's a little bit older. From the street, Gilda sensed the girl's head was a jumble of thoughts awash in resignation. The feeling was from the upstairs of this New Orleans bordello. Gilda rummaged through the thoughts, picking at each. There was little protection around her, simply a guileless perseverance. But most amazing was that the woman was devoid of dreams. She had no fantasy or embellished aspiration on which to affix her daily life. Gilda pushed into the room with her own thoughts, infinitely more directed than those of the young woman. She massaged her spirit, loosened the bonds that wound tightly around the woman's chest to help her breathe easier, then dropped a veil of sleep over her. Gilda entered the back door of the establishment and heard the patrons and business girls in the front parlor still praising a pianist and a cornetist. She slipped stealthily into the deserted kitchen and up the back stairway. She followed her line of control, holding the young woman in sleep, and past the closed doors of the corridors. Behind one door, she heard silence, no thoughts or dreams. She entered the darkened room and was stunned by the close air of defeat. The mirror was smudged, clothes were strewn carelessly, and the coverlet betrayed days of filth. It was a room in which no one really lived. The girl lay on her back, a mass of auburn curls plastered to her damp head. Her face was set in grimness, her fists clutched by her side, as if prepared to do battle with the world she cared little for. Gilda peered into the creamy white features, wondering where along the short path this one had traveled she'd lost her ability to dream. Even in the fearful hours before dawn, before Gilda could be certain there would be another night of life, dreams crept into her rest to stimulate her mind and heart. Gilda felt such sorrow at this diminished capacity for life. A small incision at the side of the neck, blood seeping out slowly. It reminded her of the wounds she and her sisters suffered on their tiny hands as they'd wrenched the cotton from its stiff branches. Lines of blood covered them until the flesh was hardened by experience. Gilda put her lips to the trickle of blood and turned it into a tide, washing through her, making her heart pump faster. Her insistent suckling created a new pulse and filled her with new life. In return, she offered dreams. She held the girl's body and mind tightly, letting the desire for future life flow through them both. The woman absorbed Gilda's desire for family, for union with others like herself, for new experience. Through these, she perceived a capacity for endless life and an open door of possibility. As the blood left her body, the woman's psyche responded with a moment of terror, which Gilda used to further suffuse her dreams with urgency. She wrapped the fear around the edge of the dream, making it all the more compelling. Gilda did not stop taking the blood until she felt parts of her dream become the girl's own. So that's from the original Gilda Stories. And as you can see, I did try to change the concept of the vampire so that it wasn't simply a predator, and have it be an exchange more than just stealing blood. And the greatest thing I hit upon was that Gilda did not have to kill everybody when she took the blood. That was a huge change for me that helped me develop the story. So any thoughts or questions? I'm happy to hear them.
Thank you so much. Over to Maisha.
Yes, well, it's so great to hear you reading from your text. I mean, I've read Gilda Stories. I've taught it actually multiple times, and it's just great to hear it in your voice. So thank you so much for joining us. Actually, since you mentioned, the idea of recreating the vampire, I was wondering if you kind of could touch upon the challenges of trying to appropriate tropes of monstrosity, especially given how monstrosity has been used against people of color and against queer populations, right? I mean, we're called monsters in so many different words so often, and it's used to disenfranchise us. So, I mean, can you talk about the challenges of centering a marginalized queer minority, but also as a monster?
Yeah. It was really fun because what I thought, I mean, at the time I first started writing it, it was way before the big wave of vampire fiction. So I think Interview with the Vampire had been out, but it was almost out of print, really, in the 80s. And I pretty much read every vampire novel that was available to me. because at that time there weren't as many as there are now. And I read a lot of the research. There has been a lot of it, and one of the things that I realized was that vampires were a mythology that permeated every culture, not just Victorian England, not just the US, I mean, small villages, we know about the Carpathian Mountains, but it was, in some level, the idea of being able to live forever. Usually you had to trade your beauty or something horrible for it. But that idea of wanting to live forever existed everywhere. And so that immediately told me I could do this story and it would be connected to everybody. And the biggest thing was, as I was working on it, my editor, Nancy Mariano at Firebrand Books, which was a lesbian feminist press, sort of halfway through the chapter, she said, Jewelle, I'm not sure you want to write a novel that has a serial killer as your main character. And I thought, now that you mention it, I don't think I do. Because I was so into the trope as it existed, I hadn't even noticed that's what I was doing. And even though I tried to make it so that she only killed bad people, she wasn't, like stalking beautiful women and killing them or helpless young men. And then I thought, well, there must be another way that this could happen, so that she exists in a world with the same kind of principles that I have as a lesbian feminist. And it meant that I had to totally rethink her behavior, her raison d'etre, actually. And so that led me to make her have a more complex family, have more complex needs, and change her focus to not just living for the blood, but living to be connected to mortals and to be connected in a way that is productive. So that the blood taking became an exchange. That was the hugest breakthrough for me. And once I did that, I felt like I could change anything that I wanted. Then I realized, okay, well then I have to create like an alternate family for her. So, it's not like I want to say all those bad vampires that existed before, they really aren't real vampires. Dracula and all the ones who are maiming and killing like willy-nilly, they're still out there. And it actually gives Gilda's family a little bit of an edge, because their job is to try to raise a family of vampires who's in opposition to that kind of murderous behavior. And so Gilda encounters them. So I figured once I knew everything that they said about vampires as the norm, then I could pick what I wanted to change. And that was actually fun.
Excellent. And it's so fabulous to hear that you actually did Dexter before Dexter was on Showtime. That's brilliant.
Yes. Yes.
So it was also interesting to hear you talk about, folks' reaction when you were first writing Gilda Stories and asking, like, why do you want to use horror and Gothic, given, the history African Americans and people of color have experienced in the US. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to what it is that attracts you to horror and the Gothic genre, especially in thinking about the Gilda Stories, and the histories and themes it expresses.
Well, two things really. It's like we're talking deeply red velvet dresses, and that's just the guys. I felt like I grew up with this Gregorian chants. I mean,
Oh,
they
wow.
sound like women screaming. So I felt that was deeply embedded in me, even though I'm not a practicing Catholic any longer. But that sense of melodrama really was embedded in me in this kind of way, and I think of Gilda in some ways as kind of Gothic naturalism, you know, because it's contemporary, and I worked really hard to figure out how to hold on to Gothic in a novel that moves into the present and the future. And the other thing I think that brought me to Gilda was I did a book review sometime in the early 80s of, I think her last name was Carrington, and I think her first name was Eleanor. I could be wrong, but her last name definitely was Carrington. And she was one of the surrealist artists of the 1930s. And I did a book review of a work of hers for the Village Voice. And she explained that surrealists believe that in order to change the world, you had to first change your dreams.
Oh.
And I thought, that is my mission. Really, if I believe in social change, which I do, and I participated in a number of social change movements, but I'm a writer, and writing speculative fiction and horror in a different way is how I'm changing dreams. I'm changing my dreams to create these stories and giving readers something else to dream about, you know. And I felt lucky that I happened to got assigned to read her book, and it gave me this philosophy that has really been at the core of my speculative fiction writing ever since.
Oh my goodness, I would love to actually read that book. That sounds fabulous. You said it was Carrington?
Her last name was Carrington. This was really a long time ago. She was a visual artist along with, those, the surrealists, the guy with the clocks that droop over the side.
Oh yes, Dali, I think.
Salvador Dali,
yeah.
Right? So there's this whole group of surrealist artists, and she was really one of the few women involved. And so if you read anything about surrealism, you'll find that as part of their philosophy. And I got to be right at the right moment.
Wow. Well, and that's actually a really beautiful way of thinking about the kind of work that Gothic can do, because quite often we think of it in terms of nightmares. But that actually kind of leads me to the second question, well, my third question, which connects to the previous, which is, considering back in the 90s, people were saying, well, why do you want the Gothic? We're looking at all this horror. But now, we're having another moment of just absolute madness and just terror of levels I never thought I'd see in my life. Just like every day is what's happening outside now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're seeing horror really becoming popular and exploding, particularly in Black communities, in ways that we haven't really seen since maybe the 70s, right? And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, why it's becoming so popular right now in a time when, thanks to the new media and technology, we can really see the nature of the violence and its consistency, its variety, and its amount in ways that we couldn't even see before.
Gosh, well, one of the reasons I think, number one, things are so crazy out there. We have to have some kind of response to it. Although the things that we're seeing in the media now, of course, were in preparation for several years before the things we're seeing now. When Jordan Peele did, oh God, I can't believe I just went blank on his first movie.
Get Out.
Get Out. Get Out. I was so mesmerized, I couldn't believe it. And I thought, how brilliant to come up with a story that embodies the horror that African Americans have felt for generations. And he put it into a horror context, and it answered every question that anyone ever asked me about why would I write horror? Because I can tell you a story that will not simply freak you the hell out, but will also tell you something about the African American experience. So I was just so pleased. Lovecraft country.
Yeah.
You know, you get to look at an African American community in the 1950s, which is beautiful enough because you see a full array of African Americans in a community, from the club singer to the guys writing the travel books to the housewife, and then there's the monsters. Yeah. And the monsters are an embodiment of the culture that's trying to kill all of the people, you know? And I just thought that was really brilliant for the novelist to come up with that, and particularly to call it Lovecraft country, since Lovecraft was such a pig.
Right.
You know, Cheryl Dunye, who's an African-American lesbian film director, her film Watermelon Woman, it's just had its 25th anniversary. And she wrote and directed the first Black lesbian feature film. She directed several episodes of Lovecraft Country. And it's been so great for her, because all the time she's been doing all of her own films, suddenly she does Lovecraft Country, and people are just, you know, falling all over themselves. And she actually just bought the rights to the Gilda Stories and hopes to do it as a mini series if she can raise the money. So it is kind of like the timing just has to line up in a certain kind of way. You know, I mean, publishers, I had one publisher, this was my favorite rejection, that, Gilda, she's Black and she's lesbian and she's a vampire. That's so complicated. And I said, well, I'm 2 out of the 3. I won't tell you which 2. And he hung up the phone. It was like, that's too awesome. Complicated. What the hell is wrong with you? But that was back then. Now people are starting to see, oh, this stuff sells. That's the big key. This stuff sells. People want to see it. And that, you know, we live in a capitalist culture, and that's makes all the difference.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I want to ask you about Dunye's possible adaptation, but I'm not going to hog up the airtime. So I'm going to bow out for now and, yeah, turn it back over to you completely. Thank you so much.
Okay, this is great. Well, so what I want to do is read you, I'm just looking to make sure it's not too long. I started writing, well, it's not actually a sequel. I started writing another Gilda book, and the chapters in this book take place in the alternate decades of the current book, if that makes sense. You know, so the first, the first chapter in the original book, The first chapter in the second book will take place right after the first chapter in the original book. So this is from, I think this is like the fourth chapter. And I use one of my favorite, I don't know if white mothers ever said this, but Black mothers were famous for this. I brought you into this world, I'll take you out of it. I mean, I don't know, some white mothers may have said it, but so the title of this chapter is called I Brought You Into This World, 1892. Samuel looked into his wife's deep brown eyes as he squeezed the life out of her, or at least he thought he had. I've heard several versions of this story, but wasn't sure how close to truth any of them came. I understood, though, that one beloved woman, abused as a child, had grown up to seduce and manipulate others to be as destructive as the uncle who destroyed her childhood. I suppose it was that history which made Eleanor's cruelty almost invisible to me. Over the subsequent centuries, tales of abuse of children never ceased to wring my heart with a barbed pain. But people had begun to speak of Eleanor and Gilda, began to speak of Eleanor and me in one whispered breath, infused with romance. All began to unravel for me in Eleanor's salon, where she held sway over the almost elite citizens of the still rustic Yerba Buena and over me. This evening I was rejoining Eleanor, eager for the intimate warmth emanating from her presence. I noted how the green velvet of the draperies matched the green of her eyes, and was thrilled at the manner in which her voluminous gown was caught so tight in her corset, it made one wonder how she could breathe. Of course, breathing was not an ordeal for either of us. It was then that Samuel, an early conquest of Eleanor's, burst through the door and marched toward her. He was not uncommonly tall nor short and quite fit. His tailor must have worshipped him because he was never less than exquisitely turned out. Except tonight it was all slightly askew. I finally come to you as a free man, my darling, he said in a low, tremulous whisper as he arrived at the small table where Eleanor sat. With our preternaturally acute hearing, it almost sounded as if he whispered in my ear as well as Eleanor's. He noted the table was set with places for two. I see you're expecting me. No, I am not. Eleanor's voice was unmistakably unwelcoming. Please leave my salon and make an appointment if you wish to see me on a future evening. From my place by the curtains, I could see rage pass over Samuel's face, and I thought to step out and be prepared to defend Eleanor. Fortunately, I remembered that although she was diminutive in size, Eleanor was not of meager strength herself. Additionally, she had been the one to bring Samuel into our dark life, so he would not risk hurting his maker. I use the phrase dark life not to denote negativity. In fact, dark to me means rich, like fertile soil, warm as were the dark faces of the family I lost to slavery, or unbound like the night sky. I know so many, even in this unruly place of Yerba Buena, look upon the darker races with scorn. Free Africans, Chinese railway workers, Mexican vaqueros, the indigenous tribal peoples, are no more than paving stones in the whites' path toward riches. For whites, we have little value beyond what our sweat can produce, or to serve as receptacles for their lust or rage. I knew Samuel to be one of those who felt this way, so tried always to avoid his company. He moved closer, towering over Eleanor as he said, "She's dead. I did it for us." Should I ask who? Eleanor's icy tone almost frosted the glass in her hand, which sparkled with the effervescent wine that was gaining popularity. You know who. Does your wife have no name? She doesn't need a name now. Please cease your nattering and remove yourself, or I'll have you removed. At that, I stepped from the shadow of the drapery and faced Samuel. I too am of medium height and build, although my shoulders are of extra width because of my labor on the plantation when a child. My physical vessel is complemented by my finely tailored wool and silk purple jacket and split skirt. I wear my thick hair in a braid wrapped as a crown on my head, and my dark skin now shines with a mist of angry perspiration. The hatred in his eyes was a fire he would not contain, but for the audience around us. Good evening, Samuel. I tried to employ the musical tones that often served Eleanor so well. Ah, he barely glanced in my direction as his voice raised in pitch. Ah, you're interviewing for a maid. I'm so sorry to interrupt. He must have seen the flame in my eyes because he turned so quickly he was barely visible as he left the salon. Gilda, I am sorry for that. Samuel is impossible. Eleanor looked up at me with a smile that felt like sunshine, the sunshine that those of our nature could never fully enjoy. Ringlets of crimson curls caressed her handsome face as if she'd not a care in the world. He's famous for his fabulous nature. He'll say anything to get my attention. Even confess to murder? I suppose, Eleanor responded. But murder may brush closer to him than just his wife. I gasped, and Eleanor said with the sweetest of tones, Dearest Gilda, let's not speak of death when we have so much life to live together. The initial stoniness inside her voice and the ease with which it melted into honey tones sent chilled ripples through my entire body. Without her speaking another word, I understood she was opening a door she expected me to walk through. A door to the true death of her former lover, her creation which she wished to discard for me.
Thank you so much. Wow. Yes, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. In that section. Yeah, amazing. Sorry, do people have do people have questions?
Well, I love reading Gilda to people, so that was great fun for me too. And the audio version, they have a woman reading it who has a much lighter voice, and she's lovely, but it's so not what I expected Gilda to sound like. But it's a lovely version.
All the questions so far are exclamations, and then when is it coming out, basically? When can we have it?
The new one, I'm literally still working on. I have not even submitted it to anyone. And my former editor, Nancy Bariano, who used to run Firebrand Books, she's helping me edit it, even though Firebrand is closed. So I would say I've probably got another year of working on this thing before I submit it somewhere.
I know with the first set of Gilda stories, they weren't all published together originally. Is that right?
Yes.
Are you doing the
Yes.
same with this set, or are they all going to be published together at the end of the year?
Some of them have been published in different anthologies. I would say 3 of the chapters have been published. There's an anthology called Dark Matter, which is a collection of speculative fiction for the last 100 years from African Americans. And I have a story in there. And the 2 others have been published elsewhere. But I'm trying to do this all together as a novel, because that will make it easier. Instead of trying to go back and create a line through. It hadn't occurred to me. I just was thinking of them as stories. And then Audre Lorde read the stories. I asked her to read them, and she said, "No, this is a novel, girl," and which set me back, to almost start all over, to make it feel like a novel, not just a bunch of random stories.
So, I mean, you've talked about the fact that they're going to be sort of intermittent chapters with the first book, and I'm wondering, when they do come out, how would you recommend reading them? The first book and then the second book, or together and intermingling?
I'm trying to write it so it doesn't matter how you decide to read it. I mean, I feel like the second book is actually, I'm toying with the idea of it being in the first person, as this story was, because the second book is a little bit more about her interior life, how Gilda manages to be who she is, the difficulty, the emotional struggle she has. That in the first book, it's kind of like she just takes on everything and she's doing it and she's like heroic and all of that. In the second book, I want it to be much more of how did she manage to find her stability. And I think you can read that without having read the first book. It'll just might make you want to go back and read the first book. But I think you can read the second book without it. I tried to keep the whole story updated, so you're grounded in who she is. I mentioned different things like about slavery and how she grew up and stuff, all during the second book.
Thank you. There's a question from Hannah O'Flanagan, and she's asking, did you find Gilda being a lesbian or Gilda being a woman of color a harder sell for people in the recasting of the vampire? And also she wanted to note that hearing you read Gilda has been an incredible experience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's always a treat for me. Yes, having Gilda be a Black lesbian, in addition to being a vampire, made it impossible to sell to the mainstream. My book was, I had an agent at the time, and it went out to every mainstream publisher in New York at the time, and was rejected by everyone. I could hear them snickering as the letters were mailed almost. And so I didn't expect it to be that difficult, since I had just read Interview with a Vampire, which definitely has the homosexual element. And I thought, oh, well, people are ready. Well, clearly being ready for gay men is not the same as being ready for Black lesbians, as we know. So I already did a lot of stuff with feminist presses. So when Nancy Mariano of Firebrand asked me if I'd be interested in her doing it, I was immediately gratified. I just thought, why am I waiting for those guys? They're always going to be behind. Commercial publishing is one of the most backward places on the country. As I said at one point, the most interesting thing that commercial presses had figured out to do in the last 100 years was to publish the same book with different color covers. You know, other than that, they were not that creative. So, and I think it ends up being a gift for me, because if it had been a commercial press, it couldn't have stayed in print for 30 years. You know, you have to sell such a high volume to have the book stay in print. It wouldn't have stayed in print, and it has been in continuous print since it was published in 91. In part because of people like Maisha, who teach it in classes. You know, now that there are classes in speculative fiction and horror, it gets used.
Maisha, did you have another question that you wanted to ask?
Yes, actually, so two questions. One, you mentioned that you you'd originally thought of the Gilda story as a collection of stories rather than a novel. So I was wondering if you could speak to the process of shifting it from a collection of stories to a novel, right? Like, what were some of the challenges that you actually had to grapple with in making that shift? Because I've seen some other people try to do it and it didn't work out so well. And then the second question, and this is sort of future projecting, but, you know, given our current situation and that Dunya has worked with Peel, I'm going to assume you're going to get the funding to do Gilda Stories. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, you know, just some of the challenges of adapting a novel for multi-series television, right? You know, in terms of thinking about like who's going to be doing the script writing, how do you insist upon certain episodes making it in, right? So yeah, it's really just questions of adaptation and writing process.
Well, so the first question was, it really, first, when I realized, you know, when Audre Lorde tells you to do something, that's what you do. So I decided we needed to, and Nancy Bariano at Firebrand figured out we needed to have a line through. So that at least in my head, when we went back to the beginning, that each chapter built on the one before. And because she's a vampire, and I had spaced it out between decades, you know, between 1850 and 1890, and then 1917 and stuff like that, it was episodic already. And I decided that Gilda Stories was a coming-of-age novel. Simply that. And that each chapter was an opportunity for Gilda to become who she is. That is, to find her footing as both as a mortal when she escaped from slavery, and then as a vampire when she joins that family. And that in each chapter, she should be learning more about herself there. And that was the line through for me. Because it was a way to move through time. That was important to me, you know, from the 1850s to 2050. The most important part for me was to build Gilda's character, you know, and that would be the thing that held it together. I'm also a playwright. I've had 3 plays produced, including a play about Gilda, which was a musical. It was great. It traveled through 13 US cities. performed by Urban Bushwomen Dance Company, which is based in New York. So I know how difficult transposing from one genre to another is, and I would never try to do a screenplay. I think it takes a whole different perspective, a visual perspective, even more so than writing an actual play. I don't know who Cheryl would pick. She's very close friends with the woman who wrote the novel that Queen Sugar was based on, which Cheryl also directed some episodes. And I'm thinking I might want to talk to that writer to kind of get a sense from her what were the pitfalls for her, because she did not write the screenplay, but to get a sense from her what were the pitfalls. I essentially, because it's a episodic novel, each chapter could be a show, so that's very easy, or parts of chapters. I've tried to, how I have a principle when I loan friends money. If a friend of mine comes to me and says, I need to borrow $50 or $100 from you, I'm just having a hard time, I need to, get through this period. I said, no, I cannot lend you any money. I can give you $100. And then I'm not thinking about that $100 ever again. And if they give it back to me, great. If they don't, it's not bothering me. I would rather have the friendship than the money. I'm kind of doing that with Cheryl Dunier and the novel. I feel like I have a lot of confidence in her. I've known her for 20 years. I've seen her skill and intellect just really develop with each piece that she's done. She did an amazing HBO film that you can't even get now called The Stranger Inside, about a young African-American woman who gets herself sent to prison so she can find her mother who's in prison. And it's brilliant. So I know her talents, and we've had wonderful conversations about the scripts and ideas and visuals and stuff. So my sense is, she can ask me questions. I said, you can ask me questions if you were concerned about doing this or not doing that. And if something seems really horrible, I will mention it to you. And as long as Gilda doesn't end up being a straight white man, we're cool. Although I do have a straight white man in the novel, so I don't want people to feel like, whew.
Thank you. Tanagra had a question, I think. Did you want to ask Tanagra?
Sure, I can ask it. I'll just read it off of what I wrote if I can find it. Okay, so you had both, when your discussion with Professor Wester, mentioned Get Out and also Lovecraft Country, and discussing the resurgence of horror in the Black community. And Jordan Peele was very straightforward that Get Out was written for a Black audience. And so, the adaptation of Gilda was announced in 2018, and then we had Lovecraft Country, Get Out. And so I'm just wondering if you think that this resurgence in horror will bring more horror that centers the Black experience. And then also if you think that resurgence will include Black queer women, because you sort of touched on that and how difficult it was to get Gilda published. And I also think that there's a habit, I'll say, of overlooking women, but also Black women, and then Black queer women on top of that, whether you're talking publishing or in film and television.
Okay, let me see if I got it all right.
Sorry.
It's interesting and complicated. In the first part, I think I feel like things go in waves. Somebody does one thing, and then, particularly in television, then 12 more show up on television because they're successful and television, you know, it's going to keep churning out the things that are going to be successful and make money. And so that Get Out was so successful, that Lovecraft Country was so successful. We can definitely expect to see more. I'm hoping that we can ride the wave and Gilda can show up on TV. You know, I'd happy for Gilda to show up on Netflix. And I think the biggest deal will be keeping it true to the principles of the character Gilda, her feminist values, and still making it exciting. I know that was the hardest part for me in terms of writing it. Okay, if Gilda doesn't kill people, how boring is that going to be? But I tried to figure out different ways to make it not boring, and that was great. And then tell me what the second part was again. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. It was a very long question. If you do think that that wave will continue, and it sounds like you do, then do you think that it will include Black queer women, not only as creators and behind the camera, but also like voices and in front of the camera as well? Because I feel like that is a very specific group that gets overlooked very frequently.
Yes, absolutely. Women are not that well considered in our culture, and women of color even less so, and lesbians even less than them. I think the wave will continue as long as people feel like they can make some money out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we as women of color and as lesbians of color need to hold on to our sense of our rights to be there. And that's going to be the hard thing, because one of the ways that people succeed in Hollywood is being, yes people. Oh, the producer comes on and tells you, oh, Gilda really should be straight, not a lesbian. And the director or the writer says, oh, okay, well, maybe we can kind of fudge that and it's still a good story. Or, oh, maybe she really shouldn't have been an escaped slave. Maybe she was just traveling around the country. And the director and the writer go, okay, maybe let's play that out. That's how films get made in Hollywood and television. If someone has an overriding idea and they have the money, the automatic response is, well, let's try it because they do have the money. I think it's going to be incumbent upon us to hold that line. This is what we want to do. This is going to be good. And if this is not going to be on Netflix, I don't want to pick on Netflix because they're fine. But if Netflix doesn't want it, they're going to be independent producers that are going to want it. And so we're going to have to work hard to keep the door open. I'm pleased because platforms are so varied and wide now. With Ava DuVernay, I know I never would say this, but because she's never going to go to Oprah. She did. We sent in Gilda to be when her book club first started. It's like that book came back so fast. But she could, it's many years later, she could be interested. But Viola Davis is starting a platform now. What's his name? The Black producer who just did the Billie Holiday film. I mean, there are so many more platforms that are specifically looking at people of color. I don't feel as frightened as I might have that she won't see the light of night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
There's a couple of, I don't know if you've been able to keep up with the chat because it's gone past quite quickly, but there's comments from Frank there's not a question in there really, just a compliment. And
oh, here's a great question.
mm,
People expected it to be raunchier and exploitative. Gilda's a lesbian because I'm a lesbian. That's my quote. And I think, and it says, I felt her sexuality is much less of a theme than her identity as a woman of color and as a vampire. I agree with that. Hannah asked that. In part because when I was writing it, getting it published in 91, I really was concerned that it become a book that the African-American and lesbian community, African-American community could embrace, and that it be a book that was more, I was thinking of it as more mainstream. So there is a really fine line between how sex and sexuality is presented in mainstream fiction and kind of, I don't know what you call it, pulp fiction. There's a definite difference in the line and how explicit you are. And because it's a coming of age story, I think Gilda was much less involved in her sexuality. It was much more about her coming of age as a vampire. Although she definitely falls in love, but the sex is not as obvious. And in many ways, that was deliberate and not deliberate at the same time. I didn't realize it until the book was over and I was published that it was like, oh, that's really kind of, where's the sex? So the second book addresses that quite a bit. There's a lot of sex in the second book, partially because I noticed it was missing, but also readership has evolved in a lot of ways. People are much more interested in and available to the sexuality, much more than they were 30 years ago. So yeah, that was the way of the world in 1991.
There's a little question from Amanda about, she loved the slice of life structure and was wondering if you had a favorite section.
Oh gosh, I will say I do love, it's hard to say a favorite section, the section that takes place in the 1950s, in the beauty shop. And like sometimes when I've done readings on campuses and stuff, I swear to you, people have asked me, is Gilda Stories autobiographical? And I say, yes. And then they take a step back. And in part it's because that 50 section is autobiographical in terms of the location in Boston in the 50s, the beauty shop. I mentioned my father and my stepmother in there. I loved writing about people I knew. So I do love that section a lot. Also, when I did the play, that the play only had that 50s section and the first chapter. And they did a really incredibly beautiful job. So that picture of it on stage is always in my head.
Amazing, thank you. There's one last comment, I think, from Hannah at the bottom. But yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers. Does anybody else have a last question? Just because I know we've sort of run over by a few minutes, but it's been such a great opportunity to chat. So yeah. Any other last questions? Do feel free if you have a last one, Maisha, or I can see you sort of sitting there.
Well, I do have one, but this is might be a bigger one than we have time for.
I'll
Because
speak fast.
in hearing you talk about including more sex in the second novel, it occurs to me that there's also, especially when you talk about African American culture and depictions of Black women, there's like this prudishness, right? There's this politics and respectability, right? And I wonder if this is something you've actively thought about and sort of been pushing against, right? Because I've noticed you also write some erotica, right? So, and I was wondering, how is this something that you're actively thinking about and saying, no, that's nonsense, right? Especially, considering, yeah, that just as humans, we are desiring subjects. But I'm also thinking about, um, Laura's essay, what was it? The politics of the erotic, or the power of the erotic.
Power of the erotic, yes.
Right.
Yes.
So the way in which the erotic, and this also gets at, a bit of Hannah's comment, the way that the erotic, it's always hypersexualized, right? And so I'm wondering if that's something you're also playing with, especially with the second one, that one can have their sex and then there's the erotic, the pleasure, which isn't necessarily porn or the hypersexual stereotype that Black women are always running from.
Short answer is, I have to keep in mind that African Americans, when they were brought to these shores, were hypersexualized by their owners, and that sex was used as an oppressive instrument against them. Their bodies were not their own, and the backlash for that is that as African Americans tried to become full citizens, they wanted to back away from that sexualization and be seen as whole people. And I was very aware of that as I was writing the book, and that some African Americans would not want to read it if there was wild and random sex. 30 years later, I feel like, we have to have evolved, and certainly I, as a writer, have evolved. And I feel like part of Gilda's growing up is her coming into her sexual self. And I couldn't have written it without that. So yes, I was aware of where I was going in the first book. I had people very upset with me because there's a scene where Gilda catches up with Bird, who was one of the people who helped raise her, and there's a scene with them sleeping together, and you can't really tell, are they sleeping as lovers? What's going on here? And for me, that was a deliberate choice, and it freaked people out. And I was like, oh well. So now I feel like, in the second book, there's one point where she makes love to a woman and she's about to take her as a vampire, and her brother has to stop her because she's getting too carried away. He said, no, Gilda, hold on back. So yes, I feel like by the second book, I'm more able to express that, and it will be received because this is another generation of people and readers.
Thank you. And I love that idea, like sexually maturing, even as like a culture, like fingers crossed.
I really appreciate your questions and your enthusiasm, and as the enthusiasm of people who've entered questions in there. Hi, Anna Keating. Hi. So this is great.
Well, thank you so much to Jewelle, and thank you as well to Maisha for coming with those questions and facilitating that discussion. But thank you again so much to Jewelle, and it's been very cool meeting you and getting the chance to sort of hear from you about your work as well. Yes, there's a lot of comments in the chat